Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app, O'Connor and Company.
It's 7:06. Thanks for tuning in here and starting your day the right way with O'Connor and Company. We're thrilled to be a part of your morning routine, and we love that you include us in your day. Coming up at 8:05, Charlie Spearing of the Daily Mail, who was covering a very busy day at the White House yesterday, including that incredible throwdown in the Oval Office against Caitlin Collins over the lies, the misinformation, the misreporting, the absolute blatant, despicable falsehoods being repeated by the media over and over again about the Maryland man, the illegal immigrant from El Salvador who had links to MS-13, who's now back in the country of his origin. The Maryland man. Well, we're going to give you all of that coming up in a bit, and we'll talk to Charlie Spearing about it. Plus at 8:35, Selena Zito. It's Larry O'Connor with Virginia woman, Julie Gunlock.
Good morning.
Maryland man. Joining us right now, friend of the program. She is chapter leader for Fairfax County at the Independent Women's Network, and just a mom who's trying to make her way through the public school system there in Fairfax. She's Stephanie Lundquist-Arora. Good morning, Stephanie. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Julie and Larry. Thanks a lot for having me this morning.
By the way, I just want you to know that there was you wrote an op-ed at Town Hall. My brother in Michigan independently this morning at before we came on the air sent me this email saying, "This is great, you should read it." It's like, yeah, I've got her on the show today. This is fantastic. So give us an update on what's going on with the Fairfax School Board, first of all, and one of the members who's been accused of embezzlement at his private firm. Is there anything going to happen to this person as he's in charge of a pretty big budget and pretty big allocations there at Fairfax County Schools?
No, thanks for asking. The story is insane. So you have a man who is a Democrat-endorsed school board member, and he's in charge of the budget committee, which is, by the way, this district has a $4 billion budget. And he was just accused of embezzling $175,000 from the company that he worked for. So Democrat leaders are trying to bury this story. I mean, they're all completely silent. We're asking them for comment. What do you think about this? At least, do we think this guy should be in charge of the $4 billion budget? That's a lot, potentially, to embezzle if they want to do. And they're just being quiet. And actually, the chairman of the Board of Supervisors, Jeff McKay, responded to somebody who asked him, a constituent who asked him the question about, I think these are great questions, like, should he be in charge of this? And he said, well, I do want to note that these allegations happened in a private firm, as if it doesn't matter. Like, well, since he's in charge of public funds, it's non-translatable. So I think that they're just trying to ignore what's happening. It's a party over principle.
Stephanie, has law enforcement been involved? I mean, what is the status of have charges been levied against him? I'm not totally up to date on the sort of law enforcement aspect of this. Is he going to face any kind of prosecution or costs for this?
I would certainly hope that would be the case. The company has filed a lawsuit, Blue Label Aviation, and as far as I know, there are no kind of criminal charges pending. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, well, it's great that he's he is in charge of Fairfax County budget, correct? Didn't you say he's the head of the budget committee?
Yeah, he's the budget chair. At the very least, they should say, probably while these things are playing out, you shouldn't be the budget chair. But just to let you know, all of the school board members are Democrats, and most, except for one of the Board of Supervisors, are Democrats. So they're trying to protect him. They're just trying to remain silent and hope that the story is just swept under the rug.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this bizarre behavior from Michelle Reed, the Fairfax County Public Schools superintendent, where she's facing some budgetary decisions that need to be made, as many major organizations are having to face right now, especially an organization like Fairfax County Public Schools, where people are leaving Fairfax County. Tax revenue is not paying off what they expected. They've spent a ton of money, including all of that COVID money they got, and now she's seeing some budgetary shortfalls. So she ordered 24 students to come into the offices so she could lecture them about pending budget cuts. Is she trying to activate them and get them to be political advocates?
Looking for a David Hogg. Looking for a David Hogg.
Yeah, this seems like very, very strange and manipulative behavior. Why is she talking to students directly and having them come into the superintendent's offices for this lecture about her budget shortfall?
Yeah, thanks for asking me this and also for publishing this piece on WMAL.com. If she were being honest, when those 24 students from 24 schools, their student journalists, were sitting around the table when she started her lecture on the budget, she should have opened it with, "Here's what I want you to write," which was the subtext of what was happening in that meeting. And how manipulative to bring in these kids to say, "Oh, I hope that they fund everything that we want." And if she were being honest, if she weren't just trying to be completely one-sided and make them parrot what she was saying, she would have brought in the Board of Supervisors and a representative from Fairfax County Taxpayers Alliance, and maybe even a firefighter, I think, was a good person to bring in to discuss the budgetary process, because what these leaders we're obviously, Fairfax County residents are being taxed to death. They're being taxed out of Fairfax County. But in addition to that, in any budget, there's opportunity costs, which the Democrat leaders in the schools don't like to admit. So part of funding a bloated $4 billion education budget is that you make serious cuts to public safety, which is what's been happening, like cutting fire trucks and stuff like that. So even if these students who were there wanted to bring up these things and say, wait a minute, we don't have the revenue, or what about the fire trucks? They probably wouldn't be able to, because student journalists don't have free press in the schools.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting.
Their thoughts are filtered.
It's interesting. I'm looking at this release from Fairfax County Public Schools about this sort of student roundtable, and I'm looking at some of the questions, and boy, is this friendly media, right? It's what will happen if your $4 billion budget is cut? What programs will be cut? It sounds a little like, I wonder, and I don't know if you've been able to ascertain that, if some of these questions were provided to the students.
That's a great question, and I kind of wondered. A friend commented in a private chat. One of the students asked about teacher salaries.
Yes,
and it was just interesting, like, just what you would be thinking of when you're a high school student, not like after school programs necessarily, but let's talk about those teacher salaries. Like that seems to me a bit planted.
I am reading these questions, and they do seem they don't seem like the kinds of questions students would ask. So that's kind of an interesting thing, possibility.
It's brainwashing, absolute brainwashing. Is there any movement or groundswell here, Stephanie, that you believe where the Fairfax residents have said enough is enough? Or is this the phenomenon where the people who are politically active and really care, that they've pulled their kids out, said they just don't care. They've shrugged it away and thought, well, what are you going to do? Or virtue signal, like, my kid's in private school, don't got to worry about them. So now I'll go out there and say, oh, the public schools are so important to us, even though their kids aren't attending public schools.
Right, like the elected officials who had their kids in pods while they kept voting to close down the schools, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a great question. I often hear people say, "Oh, everybody should just pull their kids out of public schools and enroll them in private schools." Well, in Fairfax County, that's over $20,000 a year per kid. So unfortunately, it's it would be great to just vote with your feet, but a lot of people can't do that. That's cost prohibitive. But I do feel like increasingly parents are waking up, especially with the they're trying to basically redistrict kids for the sake of equity. So you might buy a house in one school district, and then your kids are shifted to another school because they want to have equal outcomes at the schools. That's happening right now. A lot of parents who are on both sides of the political aisle are objecting to this. So I think that there is movement right now. There are so many things that are happening that affect a regular family's life directly, that more people are being activated against this. And I would like to encourage, I would really like to encourage your listeners to submit their views about the county's budget. I mean, this affects, particularly in Fairfax County, this affects all of us. They're taxing us. They want to do a meals tax. They're increasing property taxes and house valuations. There's a budget hearing April 22nd to 24th, and you can submit written comments, and you can testify. If you just go have a look at fairfaxcounty.gov, you can see ways to do that.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thanks, Stephanie.
That's Stephanie Lundquist-Arora. Good stuff. Thanks for keeping an eye on Fairfax County Public Schools for us. It's 7:17. It's like she's our special correspondent. And now she's even writing op-eds at WMAL.com.
WMAL, making sense of the news. Live from the Home Paramount Pest Control Studios. Home Paramount, the leader in pest control since 1939.
It is now 7:18. We've got a lot to say about the visit of Salvadoran President Bukele yesterday at the White House, much of it having to do with that extraordinary scene with CNN's Caitlin Collins repeating the falsehoods about the Maryland man. The Supreme Court ordered him to be returned. False. He didn't have due process. False. We're going to get into all of that coming up in a bit. But there was another stunning moment yesterday with President Bukele, and it had to do with men playing women's sports, believe it or not, when he was asked about transgender athletes. Trump actually leaned in and asked him about that because the issue came up during this is where the two world leaders sit in the gold upright, straight back chairs next to the fireplace with George Washington looking over them, and they bring in all of the press to take pictures. And usually that's when Biden would just sort of stare off into the distance in a daze like he was, still coming off the ketamine dose that he had earlier in the day. And people would shout and he would just sort of giggle thinking that he was still watching Jill babysit little Hunter in the backyard while he had little fantasies about the future doctor. Anyway, this actually is an entertaining and engaging moment when the President Trump, actually engages with the media, brings in his world leader to have part of the conversation, and he took the temperature. He says, I'm curious, in El Salvador, what do you guys do about this whole transgender athlete thing, right? You let dudes into the locker room? Here's what the answer was. Listen to the exchange.
The liberal establishment, but they're not running things anymore in this country, and we're run by, and I don't say conservative, I don't say anything, we're run by people with great common sense.
Yeah, common sense.
Because it's all common sense. Yeah. It's not liberal conservative, it's common sense.
Exactly.
And, do you allow men to play in women's sports? Do you allow men to box your women and box? Because I know you have a lot of boxing.
That's violence.
That's abuse of a woman.
Against women.
It's abuse of a woman.
Totally.
But we have people that fight to the death because they think men should be able to play in women's sports. And some of those sports, it wouldn't matter much, but it still matters. But some of them are very dangerous for women.
Some years ago, I would say a decade ago or so, women rights movements were pressuring so that we enacted specific laws to avoid men abusing women. And I think those laws were great because there were a lot of men abusing women. But now some of the same people are trying to backtrack on that and actually trying to make new laws allowing men to abuse women in a sport. So actually that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
It's great.
Yeah, see, that's the answer as somebody who hasn't, drunk the Kool-Aid of left-wing political activism and woke ideology. It's like it's common sense. That's violence. That's violence against women.
This is just normal talk. This is
Yes.
normal conversation. It is what people who are not trying to make a buck or make a woke point, this is what they sound like. And what's so great is that Trump opens the Oval Office so that regular Americans can see this kind of conversation. That is so effective.
It is super cool. I mean, you want to think that this is how Trump is with other world leaders, and they just start, shooting the stuff around the room and say, "Hey, I'm curious, how do you deal with this thing?
Yeah.
How do you deal with men wanting to pretend to be women and then get into the boxing match? And because that's violence. That's violence against women.
What do you think the effect of space is on lip filler? That was the next question.
No, the next question came from Caitlin Collins of CNN.
Here we go.
About whether Trump was going to follow the Supreme Court's unanimous order that he returned the Maryland man back to Maryland, his home, where he belongs. Of course, everything I just said that Caitlin Collins said is false and a lie, and Trump knew that, and he handed it off to his team. It was a posse. It was a pile-on from Attorney General Pam Bondi to Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and then Trump came in for the final icing on the cake, the cherry on top. It was a beautiful thing to behold, and you're going to hear every moment of that coming up next.
Now, on 105.9 FM and streaming worldwide on the WMAL app, O'Connor and Company.
It is 7:36. Thanks for being part of our morning program. Thanks for letting us be a part of your morning routine. Coming up at 8:05, Charlie Spearing of the Daily Mail, and then at 8:35, Suna Zito of the Washington Examiner. Spearing covers the White House. Zito covers America. I'm Larry O'Connor alongside Julie Gunlock. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning.
So I've been talking about this all morning. We're finally there. It's time to discuss what happened at the White House yesterday. Again, the constant misinformation that you're getting about the Maryland man. And we talked about, on the exact same day that the media is obsessed, and Senator Chris Van Hollen is suggesting that he's going to go down to El Salvador and rescue this Maryland man and bring him back home where he belongs. On the exact same day that they're virtue signaling and lying about a Maryland man who is not a Maryland man. He is a Salvadoran citizen, came to this country illegally, took up residence in Maryland, and is a known associate of MS-13 gang members, if not a gang member himself. At the exact same day that was happening, there wasn't any discussion about the Maryland woman, Rachel Morin, who was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, raped, and murdered by a Salvadoran suspected MS-13 gang member in Maryland. He was convicted yesterday. No sympathy for the Maryland woman, mother of 5, who has now been brutally murdered, or her family. And by the way, why aren't they referring to that guy, the convicted murderer, as a Maryland man? He's just as much a Maryland man as this guy who's in a prison down in El Salvador.
Right. It's amazing.
When I hear the news reports, he's not the kid. If they're even telling that story, which most news agencies are ignoring, the conviction of this illegal immigrant who was allowed in the country by the Biden administration and then murdered this Maryland woman. If they're even talking about the story, strangely, they don't refer to him as a Maryland man. Mm-hmm. But Caitlin Collins, she was trying to get a question. First, Trump actually pointed to some other reporter, specifically pointed to Caitlin Collins and said, "Not you," and then asked somebody else. But then finally, Trump relented. He said, "Okay, this should be entertaining." Points to Caitlin Collins, and it sounded like this. Cut 15.
Go ahead. Let's hear the question from this very low-rated anchor at CNN. Low-rated. Which one is that?
Who was mistakenly deported to El Salvador?
Well, let me ask Pam, would you answer that question?
Sure.
All right, so first he defers to Attorney General Pam Bondi. And she's like, sure, love to answer it. So here's Bondi.
First and foremost, he was illegally in our country. He had been illegally in our country. And in 2019, 2 courts, an immigration court and an appellate immigration court, ruled that he was a member of MS-13 and he was illegally in our country. Right now, it was additional paperwork had needed to be done. That's up to El Salvador if they want to return him. That's not up to us. The Supreme Court ruled, President, that if, as El Salvador wants to return him, this is international matters, foreign affairs, if they wanted to return him, we would facilitate it, meaning provide a plane.
So will you return him?
And you are doing a great job. Thank you, Pam. Stephen Miller, wait a minute.
All right, then he turns to say, hey, Stephen, you want to add to this? Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff. And this is so important because you're hearing misinformation. Don Beyer, your congressman, just put out on social media.
Good God.
Hold on, I just flagged it for this conversation. He said, I thought I flagged it for this conversation. He said that the Supreme Court unanimously ordered this man's return
I know.
to the United States. That is 100% lie.
What, Don Beyer not telling the truth? Don Beyer,
Yeah,
I'm not going to steal your gas stove.
He said the Supreme Court unanimously ordered his return. That is not true.
Not true.
The Supreme Court unanimously told a lower court that the lower court cannot force the executive branch into foreign relations, foreign policy, national security decisions, and diplomatic decisions. It's outside the realm, number one. Number two, what they did say is, should El Salvador release him, the United States should help facilitate that. That's all.
Right.
Facilitate.
That's it. Yep.
But to suggest for a sitting United States congressman representing Northern Virginia to suggest that the United States Supreme Court can compel the President of the United States to compel a foreign country to send one of their citizens to our country is you got to be in fantasy land to think that it happens in any reality.
But this fits into this fits into the narrative of authoritarianism that they want everything to fit into that narrative, and this idea that Trump is then going to oppose the Supreme Court, right? This is of course a court that the Democrats want to pack and destroy, right? And who they resent for actually still being an institution with a shred of respect for the Constitution. You know, Don Beyer, loves the Supreme Court when he can lie about them, but he wants to pack the Supreme Court and destroy the Supreme Court. Go on.
Don Beyer, Caitlin Collins, every teleprompter reader with a really nice haircut who continues to repeat these lies. I wish I could just one of them who dares to actually answer challenging questions. The Congressman Don Beyer of Northern Virginia will not come on this program because he knows that he will actually have to be challenged with a question. And I'm not going to be mean. You know me. I'm not a jerk. I'm not going to be mean to him. Julie would be mean to him. But she has a right to be mean to him because he's her congressman. But I say, Congressman Beyer, yes or no? Just real fast. I just want to get through the facts here. Yes or no? Can the Supreme Court force a foreign country to do something? No. Obviously not.
No.
Obviously not. So the Supreme Court cannot order this man's return. Can the Supreme Court order a foreign country to deport one of their own citizens? No, they cannot. Can the Supreme Court force the president to force a foreign country to do something? Of course not. But that's what Don Beyer and Caitlin Collins and CNN anchors and sadly news writers, people who call themselves journalists all across this town would have you think. And it's wrong and it's false. And that's not what the Supreme Court decision said. And in a moment, you'll hear Stephen Miller lay it out beautifully. There's more. There's Stephen Miller is next, then Marco Rubio. It's beautiful. And then the cherry on top is Dana Bash on CNN, what she had to say when they threw it back to studio. All of that coming up next. It's 7:43.
Later this morning on the Chris Plant Show, now that we know it was a mad left-wing anti-capitalist that firebombed the governor's mansion, let's watch the media. 9 a.m. on WMAL.
Great job. Thank you, Pam. Stephen Miller, wait a minute. Could you just also respond to that question? Because, it's asked by CNN, and they always ask it with a slant because they're totally slanted because they don't know what's happening. That's why nobody's watching them. But would you answer that question also, please?
Yes. So, as Pam mentioned, there's an illegal alien from El Salvador. So, with respect to you, he's a citizen of El Salvador. So it's very arrogant even for American media to suggest that we would even tell El Salvador how to handle their own citizens as a starting point. As 2 immigration courts found that he was a member of MS-13. When President Trump declared MS-13 to be a foreign terrorist organization, that meant that he was no longer eligible under federal law, which I'm sure you know, you're very familiar with the INA, that he was no longer eligible for any form of immigration relief in the United States. So we had a deportation order that was valid, which meant that under our law, he's not even allowed to be present in the United States and had to be returned because of the foreign terrorist designation. This issue was then, by a district court judge, completely inverted, and a district court judge tried to tell the administration that they had to kidnap a citizen of El Salvador and fly him back here. That issue was raised to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the district court order was unlawful and its main components were reversed 9-0 unanimously, stating clearly that neither Secretary of State nor the President could be compelled by anybody to forcibly retrieve a citizen of El Salvador from El Salvador, who again is a member of MS-13, which, as I'm sure you understand, rapes little girls, murders women, murders children, is engaged in the most barbaric activities in the world, and I can promise you, if he was your neighbor, you would move right away.
All right, and he further expanded on the Supreme Court decision here. That's cuts. Oh, never mind. No, that's all of it. Caitlin Collins then follows up here. Take a listen. Cut 18.
And what was
Oh no, that is
ruling
Miller.
in the Supreme Court, Steve? Was it 9-0?
Yes, it was a 9-0
in our favor.
In our favor, against the district court ruling, saying that no district court has the power to compel the foreign policy function of the United States. As Pam said, the ruling solely stated that if this individual, at El Salvador's sole discretion, was sent back to our country, that we could deport him a second time. Well, no version of this legally ends up with him ever living here because he is a citizen of El Salvador. That is the president of El Salvador.
By the way, and this needs to be the language in the order. The lower court said that the administration had to effectuate his release and return. Supreme Court said no, you can't use the word effectuate. If El Salvador chooses, then the Trump administration shall facilitate. That's the word that they use, facilitate, which is not, I mean, that doesn't mean you have to do this, right? And it specifically says, I'm reading the order right now. That's what the order says. All right, so then Marco Rubio, by the way, Bukele is sitting there in all of this, and Bukele is like, yeah, we're not sending him back. Yeah. So here comes Rubio jumping in.
Marco, do you have something to say about it?
Yeah, I mean, Stephen outlined it. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country. That's where you deport people, back to their country of origin, except for Venezuela that wasn't refusing to take people back, or places like that. I can tell you this, Mr. President, no, the foreign policy of the United States is conducted by the President of the United States, not by a court. And no court in the United States has a right to conduct the foreign policy of the United States. It's that simple. End of story.
It really is that simple. By the way, there's one other thing here because it gets muddled, and everyone's like, well, he was granted temporary permission to stay in the country because he was afraid that if he went back to El Salvador, he would face harm. He would be murdered. All right, let me just be clear here. We have asylum laws where if a person believes that the government is persecuting them politically and they could be murdered, a judge can grant them temporary asylum in that case. That's not what's happening in this case. This guy thought that another rival gang was going to kill him, okay?
Right.
That may be horrible, it may be terrible, but everybody who thinks they're going to get murdered by a rival gang in a foreign country doesn't have the right to U.S. asylum, all right? Number one. But number two, and more importantly, that rival gang no longer
doesn't
exists
exactly
in El Salvador. So he is not facing any danger. That is moot. That decision by that judge years ago is now moot. All right, so then after all of that, cut 22, Caitlin Collins comes back.
Oh, dear.
Well, Mr. President, you said that if the Supreme Court said someone needed to be returned, that you would abide by that. You said that on your correspondence just a few days ago.
How long do we have to answer this question from you? Why don't you just say, isn't it wonderful that we're keeping criminals out of our country? Why can't you just say that? Why do you go over and over? And that's why nobody watches you anymore. You know, you have no credibility.
And he went on to say, you know, you report the news like you hate America. It's like you hate America.
Yeah.
So then they cut back to CNN. And Dana Bash, I kid you, it's so glorious. Here's Dana Bash.
Say, for the record, since we heard President Trump say in the Oval Office that CNN hates our country, CNN does not hate our country. That should go without saying.
You know, here's the funny thing.
You do actually have to say it.
Yeah. If it should go without saying that you shouldn't feel compelled to say it. Yeah. And yet somewhere in the studio, hey guys, when we come back to studio, Dana, can you just clear it up and let our viewers know that we don't hate the country?
Yeah, even though we took every opportunity to hate on the country.
Since this is Holy Week, there's something in Scripture about their fruits. You know, let their fruits show who they are, and we have every reason to believe we know what tree is growing over there.
Basket
at CNN.
of fruit.
It's 7:54.